we will conduct a question and answer session. At that time, if you have a question, please press the 1 followed by the 4 on your telephone. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower left corner of your screen. If you need to reach an operator at any time, please press *0. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded Wednesday, September 14, 2011. I'd like to turn the conference over to Amanda Hopping-Wynn. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Eric. Hello, welcome to the 4th teleconference in our 2011 series. I'm Amanda Hopping-Wynn, Project Analyst here at the National Abandoned Infants Assistance Resource Center, located at the University of California at Berkeley. Funded by Health and Human Services Children's Bureau, our mission here is to enhance the quality of social and health services delivered to children and families affected by substance abuse and/or HIV, by providing quality training, information, and resources to the professionals who work directly with these families. On behalf of the Resource Center, I'd like to welcome all of you to today's teleconference training on assessing poverty as a risk factor in child neglect with Sania Metzger and Aimee Durfee. With the recent U.S. Census Bureau data reporting that over 15% of Americans are living in poverty and 22% of our children are in poverty, this webinar couldn't be more timely. Before we get started, I just wanted to review again some reminders. We will be taking questions at certain points throughout this webinar. If at any time you have a question and you're participating in the web portion, feel free to enter it in the chat box in that lower left-hand portion. We'll be taking them first come, as many as we have time for. There will also be an opportunity to call your questions in, and you would just dial 14 when prompted by the operator. I would like to, at this point, turn the call over to Sania Metzger, who is currently the Director of Special Projects at the Community Service Society of New York. She was previously the Director of Policy for the Annie E. Casey Foundation, Casey Family Services. An attorney, she served on the Casey Policy and Communications Strategy Group, the Child Welfare Strategy Group, and the Alliance for Racial Equity, working to influence and track child welfare policy at local, state, and federal levels. Ms. Metzger worked for the New York State Legislature for 11 years as legislative counsel to Assemblyman Roger Green, then chair of the Standing Committee on Children and Families. Sania, thank you for being with us today. I would like to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you for your welcome and for your introduction. I'm going to really focus my remarks today on poverty and neglect related issues. One of the reasons that compelled myself and Joy Duva, who co-authored an article related to poverty and neglect, one of the most compelling reasons for our decision to write that article really had to do with the experiences we had in the field of hearing time and time again how families involved with child welfare were being stigmatized. All of them were being universally labeled as bad parents and as parents who didn't love their kids, when we experienced quite the opposite. We understood that these poor and low-income parents had a large variety of problems, many of which are related to their socioeconomic status. And we found out, as many of you may already know, that the research tells a very different story about who these parents are that are involved with the child welfare system. And it's part of that story that I will begin discussing with you today. I have two main goals for my portion of the discussion today. Oh, pardon me. I have to go back one slide. First, I want to really provide an overview or a statement of the problem related to poverty being so misconstrued as neglect. And secondly, I'd like to identify some public policy solutions that have emerged. The basic thesis that I'm operating under is here, and essentially the argument is that if we could differentiate poverty from neglect more effectively, then we could curtail unnecessary removals of children from their homes. To differentiate poverty from neglect, we have to really focus on including parents in the decision-making processes about their futures. We have to impact not only practice, but certainly public policy and deal with, in fact, the entire child welfare financing system as a whole. To make sure we're all on the same page, I want to offer very briefly several definitions that I'd like for you to keep in mind as I walk through my presentation. Essentially, we know that poverty is the inability of one to provide basic necessities either for oneself or for those that one is legally responsible for. And so we're talking about food and shelter, clothing, health care, those really key items that are essential to human survivability and human development. We know that the United States, back in the 60s, established a federal poverty level. And we know that that computes for a family of four, according to the most recent census data, to a family's income being $22,314. In reality, we know that there are many families that fall within a larger category, which is the category of low income, and that includes, and many of those, and those are part of the subgroup that we're talking about today. And those families include families whose income range between 100 and 200% of the federal poverty level. And as many of you know, the federal poverty level has certainly come under attack and criticism from both the right and the left. I know my co-presenter will also provide a further explanation and discussion about the poverty level. Secondly, I think it's important for us to put on the table the whole concept of structural racism. Structural racism is defined, and I'll make use of a definition by the Aspen Institute. It's a term that's used to define many factors, the many factors that work to produce and maintain racial inequities in society. It identifies aspects of our history and culture that have allowed race to be identified with privileges for some and disadvantages for others. And central to our discussion, structural racism also points out ways that public policies and institutional practices produce inequitable racial outcomes. This is the redlining of communities by banks in the 50s and 60s, and more recently, certainly, the ready access of these same communities once redlined to these very detrimental subprime mortgages. Finally, neglect. Here we're really talking about child neglect. Child neglect is not defined federally, and so states have the option to come up with their own definitions, but most states include in that definition of neglect a failure of a caregiver to provide, once again, basic necessities to children in their care, including food, shelter, clothing, supervision. In many states, it also includes educational neglect as well as medical neglect and emotional neglect. But as you can see, there's really a lot of overlap between basic definitions of poverty and basic definitions of neglect. Well, what do we know? What do we know about how children and families are faring in the current economic downturn? Because this is the issue that potentially can bring an increasing number of children to the attention of the child welfare system. According to a recent report by the Annie Casey Foundation entitled America's Children, America's Challenge, Promoting Opportunities for the Next Generation, we learn, among other things, that the economic downturn has definitely taken a horrific toll on low-income and poor families, as these 3 bullet points shed light on. Almost 11% of our nation's children had at least one unemployed parent. We also see that the foreclosure rate, once again, has been particularly difficult for most working middle-class and poor families, but has hit especially hard Black and Latino families, where the foreclosure rate has roughly been 170% of that of white and Asian groups. What's most disconcerting about the trend that the AEC and the Annie Casey report pointed out is that it really spoke to a decrease in just a sense of economic well-being and increasing economic instability for these children and families that we're most concerned about, who are at the lower half of the income distribution group. In fact, current data informs us that nationally there are 20%, or as Amanda pointed to, her figure was 22%, of children who are living in poverty. The most recent data that I've seen says that there are 46.2 million people in poverty, but there are actually 31 million, close to 31 million children, or 42% of all children, who are living at or below the poverty level. And at or below the poverty level, but that includes low-income families who are in that 100 to 200% range of the federal poverty level. So we're looking at a tremendous growth in the percentage and in the number of children who are vulnerable and susceptible to the stresses and the circumstances that poverty places upon families. This slide is taken from a recent report done by one of my colleagues here at Community Service Society. It's called the Unheard Third. And what's so amazing about this report is that the data from it is really, it was collected from surveys done with low-income, moderate-income, and also higher-income families. And it provided, as it has done for the past 9 years, an opportunity for those in low-income brackets to really identify what problems they're experiencing. And so here we see, for example, that among the hardships that low-income families reported on is the fact that 31% of those in the economic category have stated that they have to cut back on buying back-to-school supplies and clothing. Food certainly has been impacted during this economic downturn. Perhaps most startling was the fact that this report indicated that 57% of working moms worry all the time about their income. So not some of the time, not 10% of the time, but all the time. This whole issue of economic security is a constant weight on them as they strive to raise their children. This brings us again to this issue of poverty. We know that poverty is a major factor in exacerbating conditions that can increase risk for child safety. Poverty is a major factor that can lead to, among other things, parental stress, inadequate housing, homelessness, lack of basic needs, inadequate supervision, substance abuse, and domestic violence. And so I think it's most important that we consider how we can tackle not just the parenting kinds of issues that so often get identified in child welfare matters, but also the underlying root causes, which more often than not are socioeconomic. Amanda, I'd like to stop here and ask, if I may, if the participants would indicate what types of economic hardships their low-income families, the families that they work with, are experiencing. Are they similar to the ones identified in the Unheard Third?
Absolutely, Sania. Operator, if we can open the line for questions. So again,
Sure.
You would dial 14 to call in with your questions and also to respond to Sania. She wants to know what your families are facing, what you're seeing with economic insecurity.
Once again, as a reminder, to register a question, press 14.
And Sania, can you speak a little bit to what you guys are seeing in New York specifically?
Oh, absolutely. In New York, we've really been hit very hard by very high levels of unemployment, job loss, wage loss, families being forced to really deplete their savings, whatever wealth accumulation that they might have had. We know, for example, that many families have been forced to move in with other relatives. We know that there's been an increase in the youth unemployment rate, which is just staggering. So we're seeing families who are already at the low-income levels of our state and city being further, their lives and their stability and their family integrity being put further at risk by the continuing economic downturn.
And Kelly Roth Rosenbrook has said that, yes, they're seeing all of the issues that you listed with the families that they serve as well.
Okay. Well, that's not surprising.
Operator, do we have any calls on the line?
There are no questions on the phone at this time.
Okay. You can feel free to continue, Sania.
All right, thank you. It's important to point out very early on in this discussion that we understand and we're not arguing by any means that poverty is synonymous with child neglect or child maltreatment. Quite the opposite. We know, for example, that there are about 900,000 calls that get reported into various state central report agencies of maltreatment annually. About 900,000 cases are reported. Some will be investigated, others will not be. And we also know that there are only about 412,000 children who actually, and I say only because that is still a staggering number, children who are in the child welfare system. And so the point is, given the huge number of families, 46 million people in poverty, again, 22 million children, we realize that 412,000 is a small percentage. And it says to me, among other things, that since we have a small percentage of children who are coming into the child welfare system, the vast majority of whom are, in fact, coming to the attention of the child welfare system, as we'll see later in several slides, because of neglect, it says to me that as a society, we should be able to step up and really meet the front-end needs of these families in order to, whenever possible, keep their children safely at home. We know that there are a number of protective factors that really help families to buffer the risk of poverty. There's been tremendous research over the decades that point to things like maternal employment and having been competently parented themselves as children, the importance of informal support systems, and the essentiality of having family support as well. These are the kinds of things that help mitigate poverty from leading to other social problems that can bring families to the attention of child welfare. It's important to note early on as well that there is a connection between poverty and race, and I'm sure this is something that you're seeing in your state. It's a national phenomenon. It stems from our history as a nation of having slavery and Jim Crow and the continuing presence and throughout institutions of structural racism. This is captured, for example, in the second bullet on my left, which points out that here in New York, but actually this is a national figure, that compared to white families with children, Black and Latino families are twice as likely to endure food instability, not knowing where their next meal is coming from. Coming back to our issue of neglect, I think what is most telling is this statistic, which comes from the 4th National Incidence Study on child maltreatment. And basically, as you can read, it points out that families who have an annual income of $15,000 or less are 7 times more likely to experience child maltreatment than those who have an income of $30,000 a year or more. And mind you, neither of those dollar amounts come anywhere near what many economists will argue is what is really required to allow a family to take care of itself, and that is an amount twice the so-called federal poverty level. We know that there is this connection, and so one of the questions we will continue to look at is what can be done about it? What should public policy be doing? Families who are involved in the child welfare system, in addition to being poor because of structural racism issues and other reasons, are disproportionately children and families of color. And so going to the third bullet here, we know that racial disparities in child welfare have to continue to be examined in the multi-system context, and that we also know that multi-system solutions are required. I'm pointing out what disproportionality and disparities looks like for the state of New Jersey, not to pick on New Jersey in any way. Oh, what happened here? 1 second.
I'm from New Jersey.
Oh, okay, as I said, not to pick on New Jersey in any way, but I like this slide because of its colors. I think it's a very clear graphic illustration of what disparities based on race and ethnicity look like in a system. So here we have African American children represented as 18.1% of New Jersey's general child population. But if you look as we go further down the decision-making process in child welfare, when it comes to entries and to placement in foster care, you can see that in New Jersey, the rate of disparity is quite high, 40.8% and 53.7% respectively. I actually chose New Jersey because New Jersey has distinguished itself, Amanda, as one of those states that was very willing to examine its own data, to examine its own practices in hopes of really improving, identifying and then improving on policy solutions that could, in fact, close the racial and ethnic equity gap when it comes to positive child welfare outcomes. So that brings us back to child neglect. As I mentioned earlier, child neglect is not federally defined. There's no mandate from the feds as to how states should define child neglect. One of the things we've seen recently, though, is that I think it was in 2009, the National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System took a major step forward from our perspective by including in its definition of child neglect a reference to financial ability, financial capacity, as you can see in this second portion of the definition. It's not just the failure to provide, but it's failure to provide appropriate care when you're financially able to do so. So standing that on its head, it's really saying that if you're not able to do so, if you don't have the means, then that should not in fact be considered child neglect. Child neglect is overwhelmingly the type of maltreatment that brings the majority of these low-income and poor families, predominantly, disproportionately families of color, to the attention of state child welfare systems. Here we can see that national figures show us that over 76% of all cases, maltreatment types, were in fact neglect. And again, I don't want to oversimplify this. I'm well aware that neglect can become severe. There are issues around chronic neglect. There are issues where neglect can certainly dovetail or spiral into more serious circumstances. But in general, if we're talking about the lack of providing basic necessities, that type of neglect, I would strongly argue, is neglect that society as a whole, state governments in particular, should address for this relatively small number of families who are really struggling to provide the basics for their kids who they love very, very much. In New York, again, we see that neglect is overwhelmingly the type of maltreatment that our state system is trying to cope with. And I think this is very different from the image that many people have of the child welfare system because of the headlines, tragic headlines of child deaths and child molestations. I think the public kind of goes away with the sense that the majority of maltreatment cases fall into these other horrific categories such as sexual abuse and so forth and so on, when that is definitely not the case as our data shows. Finally, I wanted to just share this graphic slide with you, this graph, because I think it shows quite poignantly that we're looking at a judicial system here in New York City where the filings around maltreatment are in fact neglect findings. Again, this to me suggests what we do with our resources. Instead of spending, as we do as a nation, the majority of our funding on out-of-home placement, our child welfare financing system, our Title IV dollars, 90% of them, by recent estimates, is spent on out-of-care placements, foster care and adoption. We spend about 10% on those kinds of services that can best meet families' needs upfront, early on, before problems spiral out of control. I'd like to move us now to, I'm going to skip over that question, Amanda, and I'm going to move us now to a brief discussion of public policy, and I'm being conscientious of the time here. I'm encouraged because in spite of the economic recession that we've allegedly just come out of in 2009, and in spite of the continuing economic downturn, we know from research that certain public policies have served our low-income and poor families quite well. Speaking of policies like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Care Credit, policies that have really helped to bring lots of families above the poverty line. Some of those policies, unfortunately, are quite vulnerable now because of state fiscal crises. But what we know when we do our homework, when we are informed by data, informed by evidence, we know as a society we can come up with workable, doable solutions that really help to ameliorate these economic challenges for low-income families. And on the child welfare side of things, we're also seeing some success. And for the last few minutes that I have, I'd like to quickly walk through some of those. One of the policy directions that I've been very encouraged by is the identification of a poverty exemption articulated in about 12 or 13 state statutes. Most recently, the state of Connecticut, where I worked for about 8 years, enacted a poverty exemption. And again, speaking to that issue of financial capacity, it makes clear that certain types of deprivations should not be considered neglect if, in fact, the youth is found to be solely because the youth is impoverished at or below the poverty level. So poverty exemptions is something that I would encourage people to take a look at in their states. Not only are they on the books, but are they being implemented? Next, we have child welfare and neglect. Next, we have the whole housing issue. And we're very much aware of the fact that the lack of adequate housing has been a constant theme in child welfare neglect cases. In fact, very often, too often, we're told that we know from data, we know that housing can be the reason not only why a child is being removed from care, but is also a reason which delays a child's return home, which I think is double jeopardy for families. So after they've jumped through necessary hoops and done what's required, their children still aren't being returned home because of the lack of adequate housing.
And I know I speak to our AIA grantees that's what we're hearing from them is that, one of their top concerns is that there just aren't the housing resources in their communities to adequately support the families.
This is it. And what happens is the kids stay in child welfare. The families is unable to be reunited because of this lack of housing. So that does not surprise me. I'm pleased that Senator Curry has developed a legislative proposal. It's my understanding when I last checked, it had not yet been introduced. The proposal is entitled Reconnecting Youth to Prevent Homelessness. And one of its provisions, however, speaks exactly to this issue of housing and the lack thereof. And so the portion that I've highlighted, as you can see, says that neglect, in other words, a child shall not be placed in foster care solely because the child's family is homeless or living in substandard housing. This is something that states and localities have done routinely. And again, I would argue that it really is penalizing families for being poor, which is just unacceptable, I think, in our society. And so Curry's position is that states will be required under his legislation, should it pass, to work with housing authorities. Again, the importance of this cross-agency approach to arrange permanent housing for any family that includes a minor. This will also be very beneficial to lots of older youth who exit child welfare, who end up homeless because of inadequate planning for family and permanency and inadequate financial support. We are well aware of the fact that the Obama administration, in its Rapid Rehousing and Homeless Prevention Act, provided unprecedented amounts of money in order to provide housing to both of these populations, families with kids in systems as well as older youth. But unfortunately, with the economic downturn, this essential support is being cut back, I am so sorry to report. Moving along. I'd like to basically spend the few remaining moments that I have discussing with you the public policy reform that I think that I'm most excited about. Excited because of the evidence that research has produced, the evidence that's been produced by some very rigorous randomized studies of this new policy, this new practice, and that is a differential response. I love this quote. It's taken from a statement by Dave Thompson, who was, until very recently, I think he's still there, the Child Protection Manager for Minnesota's Child Safety and Permanence Division. And I won't read it to you, but clearly, if you just peruse it and go down to that last sentence, Dave Thompson, whose state instituted one of the very first statewide differential response systems, says, you just can't say don't be poor or don't not have health care. We realize that families might be better off if we focus on resources rather than on compliance. And so the differential response system, and I know that California has a has a variation of this, does a number of things differently. What does it do? Well, it's an alternative to traditional child protection investigation responses. Cases are referred to the alternative track, especially when they do not allege serious or imminent harm. And this practice really focuses on investigating, or rather on assessing the needs of a family rather than on investigating a specific incident. Caseworkers are going in wearing a different hat and hopefully creating a different type of rapport from day one with families. In many states, caseworkers have to call ahead to let families know that they are coming in to meet with them, as opposed to the families receiving the dreaded knock at the door when they've been reported on for things like sending a child to school improperly clothed or child constantly falling asleep. All things that we care about, but things that, again, that I would argue require not an investigative approach, but rather one that says, what does this family need in order to better take care of these children? In addition, differential response, and this is very important, keeps child safety as its paramount goal, and does so by working closely with community partners. Differential response, which is also known as alternative response or dual response, really got, I think, great recognition two or 3 years ago when the federal government during the Bush administration decided to launch a national quality improvement center on differential response. I think this really was a signal to states that this is something the federal government would like to encourage. This encouragement continued with the recent reauthorization of CAPTA, the Child Abuse Protection and Treatment Act, where, unfortunately, funding was not appropriated in CAPTA's reauthorization for differential response, but once again, very specifically in the language, states were encouraged to establish, to assess, to examine, to analyze, and to implement differential response type systems. It's hard to talk about differential response without mentioning two researchers, Lohman and Siegel, who have done randomized control studies in places like Missouri and Minnesota, and most recently in Ohio, all of which had very consistent results, among them being that the rate of re-reports of families declined. We know that families were more likely to receive the concrete services that they need, and these services included things like monies for rent arrears and monies to pay utility bills, food, clothing, funding, job referrals, placement, connections to job training centers. These are the kinds of things that families themselves identified as most urgently needed. Their research, Lohman and Siegel's research, also showed, and this is so important, that children were safely provided for at home. And this ties back to that no increase in the rate of re-reports. For policymakers, it was important that the research showed that differential response is a cost-effective policy. On average, even though there are initial greater costs up front, but on average, in Minnesota, per child, the state was able to save $398, which is not significant, which is not insignificant, especially in these days and times. And finally, among the findings, I think is so important for those folks who work in the field with these families, is the fact that caseworkers and families themselves consistently registered huge success, huge satisfaction with the alternative response process. I just want to quickly point to Ohio. Ohio is one of those states that underwent rigorous evaluation, and among the results in Ohio, Ohio began its differential response system by identifying 9 zip codes which represented predominantly African American communities, and very early results showed that 93% of all alternative response cases closed within 45 days. That's just amazing. 93% closed within 45 days. This decrease, and I'm reading, this decrease specifically, a reduction in the number of African American children in state custody, both in numbers and in proportion to other ethnic groups, enabled the state to register a reduction in the racial and ethnic disproportionality gap. And so in addition to all of the other positive results that Ohio enjoyed with respect to differential response, it's one of the first states which made a clear showing that implementing differential response can also close the racial and ethnic gap that we spoke briefly about earlier. Other policies that we're concerned about have to do with multidisciplinary parent legal representation, parent advocacy, cross-agency collaborations, family team meetings, and public-private partnerships. There's so much going on across the nation with states being innovative, taking risks in order to better differentiate poverty from neglect. Minnesota, once again, has a parent support outreach project where it identifies families that may be in need of assistance. These are families for whom reports have not been made to state central registries. Ohio has been training its income maintenance and its child welfare staff with the Undoing Racism program in order to really help sensitize and deal with cultural and linguistic kinds of issues. El Paso, Colorado distinguished itself a number of years ago by actually combining the missions and the funding streams for child welfare and TANF in that particular county. And there are other examples as well in North Carolina and Texas. All of this, of course, is now under the gun, pardon the reference to a gun, because of the economic crises states are experiencing. But again, these are programs and policy reforms that indicate, that show us that there are ways in which we can, rather than use a hammer to solve problems of low-income families, use something that's more fine-tuned as a tool, a scalpel, involve them, bring them to the table, and provide those services up front in order to ensure that we're not just removing families from children who are low-income and who are poor, who are therefore more dependent on public services, who are therefore more regularly or routinely surveilled and monitored by public systems, but that we're bringing in only those families that where children's safety is an issue, where children are at risk of harm, and not unnecessarily removing children, traumatizing children and families by using one type of an approach. So I'll close there, and if there's anything at all that you take away from my brief presentation today, I hope it is that parents in particular who are involved with the child welfare system, take another look at them, find out who they are, find out what their needs are. Don't buy into the stigmatization that these are bad parents who don't love their kids. Nothing could be further from the truth. Thank you.
And operator, we would like to open the line for questions. If you have any questions for Sania.
Certainly. As a reminder, to register a question, press 1-4 on your telephone keypad.
And Sania, can our program participants also contact you directly with questions at this email address that you have listed?
Oh, yes, most definitely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions on the phone?
There are no questions on the phone at this time.
Okay, then we are going to move forward. If any questions come up that you have for Sania, there will be time at the end of the call as well, so you can ask them there. Now, what you're seeing right now is a poll if you're participating in the web portion. And what you would do is simply pick your answer and click on the bubble next to your answer and submit that. And we'll give this time so that people can respond. But please submit your response. And in the meantime, I'd like to introduce Aimee Durfee, who's here straight from a morning interview on National Public Radio. Aimee works at the United Way of the Bay Area with agencies in Napa and Solano counties to develop and fund new collaborative solutions to community problems in the areas of income, education, and health. Through her career experience at numerous legal, policy, and direct service nonprofits, she has expertise in law, workforce economic development, employment, labor, public benefits, and women's economic self-sufficiency issues. In her role at United Way, she provides technical assistance, fundraising support, and facilitation to United Way's Spark Point centers, which are working to help families build income support and assets, improve credit, and reduce debt. Before coming to the United Way in 2007, Aimee worked as an advice and counsel attorney at the Transgender Law Center. Prior to that, she was a program manager at the Insight Center for Community Economic Development, where she led Californians for Family Economic Self-Sufficiency, a statewide policy initiative. In this position, she created coalitions to pass state and local legislation related to welfare reform, wrote and edited numerous major reports on the Self-Sufficiency Standard, and served as spokesperson and coordinator of press events around the state on poverty issues. And Aimee, I would like to turn it over to you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So your poll answers are very interesting. It looks like about 44% of people thought that the poverty line was calculated using the cost of housing and food. That's our number one answer. Our number two answer is using the cost of food only. And a significant number of people, actually, no, that's number three. Number two answer is none of the above, which I think is actually fascinating. I'm curious about what you think about the poverty line. The correct answer is the poverty line is calculated using the cost of food only. And, you know, your answers reflect really the inconsistencies and the problems with the federal poverty line, is that it should be calculated using the cost of housing. The federal poverty line is, it's a one-size-fits-all measure that's based solely on the cost of one item, which is food. It's calculated using the cost of food times 3. And so because it was developed in the early 1960s and it relies on the outdated assumption that food accounts for 1/3 of a household's overall expenses. And the other interesting thing about the federal poverty line, which is completely outdated, is that it was developed before most women entered the workforce. And so it actually assumes a 2-adult household where one parent is working full-time and the other stays at home. And we know that is not true for most families. The other sets of problems with the federal poverty line, it doesn't vary by the ages of people in the household, and nor does it vary by geography. So the poverty line is the same whether you live in San Francisco, New York City, or a lower-cost place like Topeka or, Idaho. So the problem that we have when we're talking about poverty is that we have the wrong numbers in the equation. And policymakers are making decisions about eligibility for benefits, about allocation of funding using the federal poverty line. Now, we do know the U.S. Census has come out with a supplemental poverty measure which is addressing some of these issues. But the numbers that came out just yesterday, the day before, that Amanda referenced at the beginning of this webinar, are still using this old measure. So if we have 22% of people so the children in this country who are below the federal poverty line, there are actually many more children that are still struggling who, as Sania mentioned, are low income category. So let me say a little bit about a more accurate way to measure poverty. And after I go through this, just very quickly, I'm going to talk about some ways that we at United Way have found to address, the issues of actually helping people get out of poverty. And we use this more accurate measure to guide our work. The Self-Sufficiency Standard is a measure that's been calculated for about 30 or 40 states all over the country by Wider Opportunities for Women. And it includes some of the elements that you all indicated were important in determining what it costs to pay for basic needs. Those are very, very basic. There's no category in here for birthday parties. There's no category in here for school supplies. So this doesn't even really cover it. But it is much higher, as you'll see in a minute, than the federal poverty line. But it covers all basic expenses. The Self-Sufficiency Standard, you can see on this chart, for California, this is an average, is about $52,889 for 2 adults, 1 preschooler, and a school-age child. The federal poverty line for that size family is $21,000. So the Self-Sufficiency Standard, this is just an average for the state of California. The Self-Sufficiency Standard is actually calculated for every county, so all different county expenses. And it's also calculated for over 70 family types. So it includes single adults without children, 2 adults, and then it varies by the age of the child. If you have an infant, your child care costs are going to be much higher than they would be for a high school. So what does this all mean, and how does this relate to what we're talking about here today and the relationship between poverty and neglect? The clients that you all work with, I'm sure this is no surprise to you, but the public supports that we have in place are inadequate. Sania mentioned this over and over. And part of the problem is the federal poverty line. So, for example, food stamp eligibility is based on the federal poverty line, 100% of the federal poverty line. Head Start eligibility, with some exceptions, is 100% of the poverty line. School lunch is based on a 130% and 185% of the federal poverty line. It goes on and on, is that we're basing all of our decisions about what people are eligible for on a completely faulty number. Then also, the other end of the public benefit spectrum is that after you become eligible for public benefit, they're not actually always providing what is necessary. The average food stamp budget is about $1 a meal, which I find completely shocking, and people somehow live on it.
And then we wonder why we have childhood obesity rates.
Correct. And that obviously relates to parental stress, which is, it's all connected. Also, when you're talking about, so in California, our TANF program is called CalWORKS. It would actually take more than 4 times the average CalWORKS and food stamps benefit to meet the needs of a single adult preschooler and school-age child family. So the CalWORKS and food stamps benefit doesn't even bring a family up to the level that they need to be. Minimum wage is lower than self-sufficiency standard in many places. So the problem is that we're under the illusion that we're accurately measuring poverty when the problem is much worse, and we're missing people who are working hard, they're working in low-wage jobs, but they don't have enough, they're making too much to be eligible for public benefits, but they're not earning enough to pay for those supports in the marketplace. And these are the working poor. So in the Bay Area, which is where I live and work, we've started to address this problem in a very big way. We've decided that we want to set a goal for ourselves to cut Bay Area poverty in half in the next 10 years. And we're using the Self-Sufficiency Standard as our guide and as a goal of what people actually need. 20% of the families in our area have incomes too low to pay for basic needs. And many of these families, 86% of these families who don't have enough to pay for food, shelter, clothing, childcare, 86% of those families have at least one working adult. So this is not about people who are not working. And now we have an unemployment crisis, which is making this even worse. So the whole point of me saying all of this is that we have to do things differently in the social service sector, in the public sector, and in the private sector. Getting a job isn't enough. Getting all the benefits you possibly can be eligible for isn't enough. And the end result, which all of you know, is that the children in these households are at risk. One final slide on this topic, which is that poverty is not just about the numbers, it's also about lack of opportunity. This is a staggering statistic about the fact that class mobility is actually much more restricted today than it was 30 years ago. That if you start out in poverty as a child, it is much more likely that you will stay there as an adult. The economy is set up so that people who graduate from high school 30 years ago could find a job. They could find a manufacturing job. They could find a job that actually paid for their basic needs. Today, that's no longer true. So let me keep going here about the response and what we can do about this. I guess I've told you a little bit about our framework at United Way and the goals that we're shooting for. Now, the next set of slides are about the kind of responses that we all have in our communities. I work very closely with community-based organizations, county governments, and are fully aware of the tensions and there's no funding and people are struggling just to keep the doors open and they've got increased need of clients. And this is really a step back from that to look at two different kinds of organizations and programs that help people who are in poverty. And the first kind is safety net. These are programs that help keep people alive so they can function. So it's food, shelter, clothing, health clinics, subsidies, diapers, utility assistance, detox programs, rehab. And then there are programs that are taking that foundation after people are kind of stable, and they work with families and adults to actually get out of poverty. So those are programs like job training, asset building. So United Way, we're looking at how do we connect these worlds so that we can actually help more people get out of poverty. The traditional programs that we have for low-income people, the safety net programs, are primarily focused on addressing gaps of our market system, helping people get things they can't pay for because their incomes are too low. So what's the issue is that when most people think about programs for people in poverty, think about the food bank. The food bank is an incredibly important resource that keeps people alive, that allows people to continue to go to work and keep their families together. But it's not the whole solution. And so what we want to look at is the whole solution. The next step is you're looking at strategies to help families get out of poverty. And I'm going to stay on this slide for a little while because these are strategies that are being tried all over the country that are innovative, that are bringing unlikely partners together, that are taking the social service sector and bringing it into a new way of operating beyond just giving people things to fill the gaps in their lives, which, as I just want to make clear, is incredibly important and is foundational for this work. Over the last 15 to 20 years, some fields have begun to emerge that are doing this. And these are programs that help individuals, do more than just survive. They're helping people get access to opportunities that are usually set aside for middle-class people. So industry sector initiatives, and on here I've put websites of resources that are either here in California or are national resources if you want to check out how to bring some of these types of programs to your community. Industry sector initiatives are, the goal of these type of initiatives is to transform industries so that they provide career ladders for lower skilled people and job training to help them move up. Now this requires you to get to know some people who know a lot about job training, who know a lot about industry, but this is what I'm talking about, is we've got to work together differently. What happens inside an industry sector initiative is you're bringing employers and the community to the table at the beginning of the process. When what you're doing is you're matching employer needs with community skills and identifying training gaps. So one example of this is if you have a number of hotels that are being built in a particular community and you see, wow, they're going to be hiring a lot more people. Let's see what kind of job opportunities we could provide for our local folks who might not otherwise get access to those opportunities. There are sector initiatives in the healthcare industry, in the entertainment industry, in the construction industry. And the idea is that you're opening up opportunities for clients who wouldn't otherwise get into those apprenticeships, who wouldn't otherwise get into those training programs. And the social services side of it is providing people the support so they can get the equipment that they need. They can keep their car so they can drive to work. You're finding them childcare, giving them help to find food so they can actually stay in these training programs and break into the next level of income. The next area is women in construction, and this is an area that's near and dear to my heart. Women are often excluded are women. And these are incredibly high-paying jobs. And there's a whole movement to actually open up construction trades to more women, to recruit, hire, and retain more women in construction. You can see there's a lot of barriers to this. Some of it is discrimination. Some of it is the fact that there's not a lot of child care available at 5:30 a.m. There's training barriers. There's all kinds of things. But there are women all over this country who have successfully entered and risen in the construction trades, and it is an income opportunity for women. There's a lot of work going on around this around the country. Individual development accounts are a strategy that some of you may have in your community. This is a matched savings account, and it is for low-income people, and what it's doing is dispelling the myth that low-income people can't or don't save money. The way an IDA is the shorthand for it. An IDA is structured where if a person puts in $1, there's a match for every dollar that they put in. The goal of the accounts are for specific goals that are asset-building goals, like purchasing a home, starting a business, or attending school. Many IDA programs have federal funding. There's a federal funding stream that's specifically designated for these types of programs. Some are independently and privately funded and have added other goals, like people saving to buy a computer or a car. And the concept of having a matched savings account is something that this is another way where we're working differently. We've got to work with financial institutions, which takes me to the next point, which is Bank On. Some of you may have heard of Bank On. There are Bank On programs all over the country. The idea with Bank On is that these are quote-unquote, second chance bank accounts. I'm sure you have a lot of clients who have distrust banks or have been shut out of the banking system because they've bounced too many checks. And what Bank On programs do is they are partnerships with banks where banks agree to offer people a second chance, basically. They offer them an account that is it's a little more restricted. Some of the banks require people to go through some basic financial education about how to use a checking account. These accounts also have some benefits to them. The banks have agreed to waive fees for a year. They accept alternative forms of identification. So the Bank On program is a model that can be replicated in your community, and there's plenty of technical assistance for folks who are interested in starting that. Another alliance with the financial world that I haven't put on here is actually free tax assistance sites. And these are programs that it's an alliance between, in our community, the United Way and the IRS and local community organizations, helping people file their taxes for free. So I just want to keep on this theme of unusual alliances and how these are the kind of things that we need in order to help clients actually get out of poverty. The last point on this slide are the Spark Point Centers. And this is an initiative that United Way has, our United Way of the Bay Area in California has started in our region. Spark Point Centers, I'm going to get into this a lot more in a few slides, but these are integrated service centers where clients can go to increase their income, manage their debt, fix their credit score, and get access to the financial mainstream. So let's keep going. And I want to say something about our perspective on getting out of poverty. And these are just a few insights that have shaped our approach. And the first one is that, this is no secret, poverty is a complex problem. And if we could have solved this problem with a single approach and a silver bullet, we surely would have done it by now. We know that poverty is very challenging. It has many forces behind it that require a comprehensive and thoughtful solution. Many services, and this is the fault have services that are siloed, and then individuals have a hard time even just getting to them, piecing them together. The second perspective is that, sort of related to this, is that it is challenging for people to find and use social services. We have a lot. I can't count them. Surprising the number of times I have heard some organizations say, we cannot get people to come to our doors. And a lot of it is transportation, or people don't know about it, or it's not being marketed, or whatever. But some of it is also about the hours. There's all kinds of barriers. But, so we're thinking about that and how, we can work with social services, nonprofits, and public agencies to make it easier for people to actually get the services that they need. And our Spark Point initiative is one way we're testing that out. And then the third perspective is a little different. And this is about, this is something where I think nonprofits have a little more freedom to change their perspective than public agencies might. And this is about a focus on clients who have to meet eligibility requirements to get services versus viewing clients as customers or guests or members who are offered incentives. And it's a really different perspective on how you interact with clients, and obviously it's different according to the discipline that you're dealing with. But, what's driving this is that in many, but not all, that in many social service programs, the goal is behavior change. Like a homeless shelter is working with residents to help them get up on time and look for work. And you're dealing with a lot of issues there, but you're trying to motivate people. A family resource center is working with adults on parenting skills. A child support program trying to get a father more engaged in his child's life, or a community action agency that's working to help people budget their money. So we want to encourage agencies to start thinking about clients not as, come in, are you eligible, are you not eligible, this is what you must do, here's our program, but instead thinking about clients as, here are all the options of services that we have available. What do you want to do? And really tapping into the motivation that people have inside of them and the strength that they have inside of them. I know that many folks who work in social services do that on an individual basis, but often the structures that we work inside are not amenable to that, because it's usually about outputs, outcomes, how many numbers of people did you get to do this, and were they really eligible? And so we're looking at how can you really shift that, because we think it's more effective to use an incentive system than really a sort of more punitive eligibility type system. So there's a whole other webinar in that concept, but I just wanted to put that out. So let me talk a little, before I keep going, let me stop and see if people have any questions or comments.
So operator, can we open the line for questions?
Certainly. Once again, to register a question, press 1-4.
Sorry, go ahead, operator.
Yes, I was going to say we have a question from the line of Chris Basiletti from the Santa Cruz community. Please go ahead.
Hi, I don't know if this is a question or just a comment, but I'm going back to the slide on poverty equals lack of opportunity. The comparison between 30 years ago and today and the number of children born into poverty. I'm just wondering if you can speak to the percentage obviously is so high today, and I'm just wondering what the disparity is or what the parallels may be regarding your comment on back then 30 years ago somebody could go into some sort of blue-collar work. I can't remember exactly what you said, but I'm just wondering why we have such higher rates today when we consider, again, 30 years ago, our societies weren't as technologically advanced as they are, so the competition may have looked differently, but also to consider the population increase and expansion of or over 30 years. I'm just trying to draw the parallel between what's happening, that we're seeing higher rates of children born into poverty today than 30 years ago, to consider all the other variables, et cetera.
Yeah, I think you have hit on a lot of the variables. I think there's a lot of things driving this. I mean, we've lost our manufacturing base. Our educational system has eroded. If you think about University of California, for example, my father went to University of California, Davis, working in a gravel pit over the summer. He could pay for his entire year doing that. My father is, much older than 30 years, but today, University of California, which is our gem of a public university system in this state, costs about $22,000 a year to attend, which is sort of, it's out of reach for most people. And when you look at the economic system that we have, and like as you said, it's much more technologically driven. That requires more education and skills. A college degree is much more. It's more necessary for more of the industries that we have here. The other growing set of industries that we have in the United States are the service sector, which are, restaurant jobs, hospitality jobs, that are often very low paying. So we're sort of bifurcating our system of opportunity and making there's a much bigger leap that people have to make now. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions, operator?
There are no further questions at this time.
Okay.
All right. So let me talk a little bit about the Spark Point centers that United Way of the Bay Area is putting together. So if you think about what financial stability is, we've put together 4 outcomes for these Spark Point centers. We want people to achieve a livable income. We want that to help them get to a good credit score, and good being sort of the level that you need to be able to get other things that you use your credit score for. Accumulation of assets, and we want people to get to manageable debt. And so what we've done is we put together in every county of our region, which is 7 counties, we put together collaboratives of organizations that provide these kinds of services. And we've asked them to actually agree to serve clients with common outcomes, which is very different from how most collaboratives work. These agencies have actually agreed to subsume their identity into a Spark Point center. So a client walks in, and all they know is they're in a Spark Point center, and they can get access to all these different services. They don't have to get a referral form to go from the workforce development person to the credit person who's across town. That we're actually bringing them all together. These agencies have joint outcomes. They are tracking data together in a single database. They have a joint budget. They're doing joint fundraising. I mean, it's a collaborative where the services are integrated and bundled. They work with clients for 2 to 3 years, and we're looking at these outcomes as opposed to outputs. The reason that we're doing this at all is that we're basing this model on the NEKC Centers for Working Families, where bundling services like these together actually achieve much better outcomes for clients. So the graph that you're looking at, we are seeing in our initial data collection that we're getting similar results to other centers for working families around the country. You can see Central New Mexico and Bon Secour in Baltimore. Those are sites that were started many years ago who are shown this kind of trend, that when people are able to bundle these services together, that they actually have better outcomes and are able to start the process of getting out of poverty. We know getting out of poverty is a complex problem, so we're trying to address it with a complex solution. This is just a list of the Spark Point centers that we have open in the Bay Area. We've actually got United Way. They won't necessarily have a Spark Point Center, but many United Ways have a strategy related to integrating services.
And just to clarify, Aimee, when you say that these different entities are assuming their identity when they become part of SparkPoint, it might just be a piece of workforce development. It doesn't mean that all of workforce development is now a SparkPoint Center. They might just be sending one worker to the center to be designated SparkPoint worker.
Right.
Okay.
So I'll give you an example. There's Family Resource Center that I work with in Napa County, that inside that Family Resource Center, they have a job developer, they have a credit counselor, they have a foreclosure counselor, and they also have a person who helps people get on public benefits. Plus, they do all their regular Family Resource Center stuff like parent engagement, parent education, mommy and me, that kind of stuff. And they're also the reason that Family Resource Centers are engaging in the SparkPoint model is precisely because it helps them deal with their mission of achieving family stability. That for all of the reasons that we've been talking about this whole webinar, is that poverty and child neglect outcomes are linked. And so the SparkPoint model and some of the other models that I've mentioned are ways that child welfare systems and workforce development, asset building, all these different worlds can come together to actually help achieve the ultimate outcome of helping these kids have healthier, more stable, less violent lives. Let me say a little bit more before I close here. And, one of the things that we're working on United Way is looking at the systems change. I mean, this is the kind of thing where you can build a model at the community level. What we're hoping to do is take this kind of integrated model and take it to a much larger scale. The system that we have now is set up to support an older, fragmented model. And these types of programs, the public policy proposals that Sania mentioned, those are things that have got to be lifted up and advocated for in order to bridge the divide between these different worlds. We need to advocate for policies and funding streams that more accurately measure success, and that's going back to, are we talking about getting people above the federal poverty level, or are we really talking about getting people out of poverty? And we also need to look at the amount of time that it takes to do this. I mean, working with someone for, if you get a grant and I've got 12 months to get 15 people through this program, is that really, it's gotten them through the program, but is it really getting them to out of poverty? So we want to look at, can we, programs that need 2 to 3 years to actually help people move out of poverty. So let me stop there and see if people have questions or comments.
Operator, we'd like to open the line.
Certainly. As a reminder, to register a question, press 1-4.
And while we're waiting for questions, Suzanne Clemens wrote in and said, with our limited resources, how do we get around eligibility requirements? I understand that the federal poverty level measurement is faulty, but how do we ensure our resources are put to the best use?
That is a very good question. It depends on where you're coming from. So it's obviously, if you're in a county health and social services system, you are dealing with a certain set of eligibility requirements. If you are, but one thing that local county welfare departments can do is they can apply for waivers to pilot different programs. It all depends on what you're trying to do. There are also, like here in California, there's programs that are inside welfare departments. They can do them, but they just don't for whatever reason. Like, for example, if you're on TANF and you want to start a micro enterprise, you can actually do that using your TANF time. But a lot of welfare departments don't really tell people that. They don't really help people do that. There's also, you have the ability in California to have an individual development account if you are on TANF. Not many welfare departments actually do that. So there's ways around the current system, and I would say if you're in a nonprofit environment, experiment with, how your program could work with people at different levels. I know it's always a tension between the number of people coming through your door and how much time you have to spend with them versus, having more time to spend with a fewer number of people. But, I think some of this is about reaching out to unusual partners and looking at how do your eligibility requirements line up? Do you have, how can you more closely align where you do have control over who's eligible for what?
I wonder if some of the hesitation here too is that there are so many people right now who are in poverty based on the federal poverty line, as low as that may be, that I think that a lot of these agencies are feeling the tension because they want to help the neediest. And looking at this different view of poverty, while it's essential and while it's relevant, it means that they would be servicing a whole slew more people when they don't even have resources necessarily to serve the neediest. And what I'm hearing you say is that that's why the agency collaboration and this different way of thinking about partnerships is just so critical.
And I also think that it's not an either or, because we come at this with such a scarcity mentality that, we've got to redefine the problem. We've got to redefine the problem. And that, like you're saying, if we look at the self-sufficiency standard, there's double the people are in poverty. But, there should be resources at the state and federal level to actually deal with the real problem. And the barrier is that no politician wants to have the number of poor people go up while they are in office. So that's really my point of view is I think, you do have to focus on serving the people who have the most dire needs. And we have to start re-examining the problem so that we're actually helping to meet the needs of all folks who have incomes that are too low to make ends meet.
Absolutely. Operator, do we have any questions on the line?
No, we don't have any questions.
Okay. Well, I want to thank both Sania and Aimee so much. Sania, do you have any closing thoughts? Are you still on the line with us?
Oh, yes, I'm still on the line. I have one closing thought, and that is, it really speaks to the first question that was posed to Aimee, and I would just build on her response and say that I think another reason why we have a generation that's not looking to do better than their parents has much to do with public policies that have really furthered and widened, rather, the wealth gap between the very rich in our country and those that are barely making it. And I'll just stop there. But that certainly is a result of public policies, from taxation to other kinds of things, which are supportive of one group as opposed to another.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah. Well, if any of you are listening and you share this information with colleagues who want to access this webinar, it will be available on our website in about 2 weeks. We do greatly value and seriously consider the feedback of everyone here participating on the call. So a brief online evaluation form is going to pop up at the very end. And if you could take a few moments to complete that form and return it to us, that would be wonderful. In addition, because we want to receive feedback from every participant, if you're participating in this call as part of a group, so if you're all sitting around the conference table listening, if each one of you has time, we would love if you could follow the link on this slide to access that survey. So again, thank you to our presenters and to you for your participation. We hope that you found this to be a valuable experience, and we do look forward to receiving that feedback. I hope you have a wonderful day, and if you have any additional questions that come up, I believe that both Aimee and Sania are open to getting email queries. So thank you again for your time.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude the webinar for today. We thank you for your participation and